I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased to be hosting this talk this afternoon, particularly with Kirsten Sehnbruch, who is a former visiting scholar and lecturer at UC Berkeley and at the Center for Latin American Studies. She is now a professor of economics at the University of Chile and director of the Center for New Development Thinking. I'd like to also introduce someone who is with us today with Kirsten, Roberto Gonzalez, who is the academic vice chancellor of the Católica University in Chile, in Santiago. So please join me in welcoming Roberto. Kirsten Sehnbruch will be talking about a particularly compelling theme, the 20 years of center-left government in Chile, what it did, the obstacles it faced, how it contrasts with what preceded it, and what implications that might have going forward. She will first speak, and then we will have time for questions and comments after. So please join me in welcoming Kirsten Sehnbruch.
Thank you very much, Harley. Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be back from Berkeley, of course. As Harley said, this period is about the 20 years of center-left government in Chile, the period of the Concertación. This is the book that I'll be presenting, and I'll hand it around so that you can all take a look at it. We weren't allowed to use the word Concertación in the title. The editor, the publisher prevented us from doing that because apparently having a foreign word in the title of the book kills the sales. But so hence the title, Democratic Chile, but really what I'll be talking about are the 20 years of the Concertación. At some point there'll be some flyers arriving which I'll hand out because they give you a summary of the book, and they also give a very significant discount compared to the Amazon price because it's a relatively long volume and they tend to be relatively expensive. But what I'd like to talk about is present the book as a whole, but of course it's impossible to present 400 pages in half an hour. So I'll be focusing in on the overall theoretical framework of the book and the arguments related to the political chapters, and then as you'll see in a minute, there are two halves to the book. One half is political and the other half is public policy. I'll focus in on a couple of selected issues from the public policy aspects, and then we can have an overall discussion. Just as a reminder, of course, this 20-year period ended in 2010. We started writing the book in 2011, 2012. So of course everything that happened afterwards, like the student movement and how they changed the political agenda, aren't really part of this book. We touch on it in the conclusions, but certainly I'd be very, very happy in the debate afterwards to answer questions and to discuss those issues. So, as I mentioned, there are two parts to the book. The first is really an analysis of the politics, with chapters on the government itself, the 20 years, the coalition that governed, the Concertación, the opposition, the constitution, and a lot of the relevant issues that from the political spectrum influenced the actual development of Chile. So this book is a collaboration which brings together some interesting aspects in a number of different ways. First of all, my co-author or co-editor, Peter Ciarelis, he's a political scientist, and this is kind of his half of the book. I'm more a development public policy expert, and what we tried to do in this book is to see how the two worked together, and how the politics shaped the public policy, and in turn the public policy results shaped the politics. And really that circle came full circle with the student demonstrations in 2011, where the results of the public policy ended up producing a very significant political shift. And so now it's like we're in a new cycle. We can talk about that in the questions. But this is the first half of the book. The second half goes into specific topics, such as the economic development of Chile, fiscal policy, social policy, poverty, education, labor, etc. The other thing that we did in this book, which I think worked quite well, is we brought together a lot of authors from the United States who are Chilean experts with Chilean authors, and we tried to get them to work together. This meant that we brought together authors who have a nice overview perspective of what's going on in Chile, together with the local knowledge that you get from being in the country and from following everyday affairs, but where you don't always incorporate the sort of outsider overall perspective. So that means it has a little bit more of an international perspective than books like this. It's also the first book that's been written about the Concertación, except for a few political volumes that have been published in Chile itself. So those of you who are interested in Chile might be interested in knowing that there is another book coming out on the Concertación by a historian, but it's been like 5 years in the making, so I'm not sure when it's going to come out. This was put together relatively quickly, as quick as the editorial world functions. It took us only a couple of years. Now, of course, the book is already quite long, but there are, of course, some limitations. There are topics that we very clearly didn't cover. There are no chapters on the environment, energy, social movements. There are all sorts of topics that we didn't really touch on and analyze in detail. I would also say that the political analysis is kind of limited to the macro level. The micro level, the clientelism, how the institutions function from the bottom up towards the top, how they influence elite politics, that isn't really part of the book. And in fact, it constitutes our new research project. As I mentioned before, it was written between 2011 and 12, so everything that's happened subsequently isn't really part of the book. And what's interesting now is that the book, from the perspective of Chile now, the book already seems like history, because things have changed so quickly in such a short period of time as a result of the student movements that really the Nueva Mayoría, which is the new name of the Concertación, it's a new coalition, a slightly broader coalition that has been formed. It's incorporated many of the criticisms that were in the book. So we're in a new political cycle, and really this book is about the historical period, and is an attempt really at looking at the Concertación from the perspective of the future historical interpretations. So what is history going to say about the Concertación? How did the Concertación do? And of course, you know, the Concertación was a very remarkable coalition. It was in office for 20 years, which is an achievement in and of itself, in political terms. Very, very few coalitions maintain themselves in power for that length of time without within a democratic system that's truly democratic. So of course that begs the question, how did the coalition maintain itself in power for that many years? How did it transform Chile in every sense of the word, politically, socially, economically, culturally, in every sense really? And then we try to engage quite a bit with the question of whether Chile really is a model. Is Chile a political model? Is it an economic model? There are different interpretations of Chile's success, in inverted commas, depending on the perspective, depending on how you look at Chile. So that's also a topic that we engage in. And then I think the crux of the historical interpretation of this period in the future will be the question of how far did these four governments go in terms of progress, the progress they initiated and instituted. How far could they have gone? What else could they have done? And where is the frontier of the possible? I borrowed this expression from President Lagos, who talks about la frontera de lo posible. How far did they go? How far could they have gone? And the transition points in the various different governments where you begin to think, well, here they're kind of sitting on their laurels and they didn't take the next step, or they didn't go as far as they could have done. It's the discussion of, you know, the glass is half empty, half full. To what extent is Chile a model really to be admired, and to what extent did they do things wrong? this is like a theme, like a red thread that runs through the 4 Concertación governments. It's very much tied up with the arguments about the political transition in Chile, and it's of course a subject that is very clear in the public policy chapters, because in every social policy or public policy aspect, you come to a point where they could have gone further, but didn't, and you start to begin to question why. So that's generally a theme of the book. We also argued that the roots of the Concertaciones, and with the Concertación also Chile, because the Concertación of course shaped Chile to such an important extent, the roots of in the roots of its success also lie the roots of its failure. And this is also to do with what I was just saying about the frontier of the possible. To what extent were the public policies successful, and at what point did they begin to be less successful or even fail in some aspects? And what we do in the public policy chapters is we try to define those moments. We call them transition points. So up until what moment in time were the governments really pushing for the best possible progress, and at what point in time did they become somewhat complacent? People who know about health insurance. Is Juan Pablo Atal here?
Yes.
Yes, I heard you do research on health, and the ALCA is probably one of the subjects that you've been looking at. This is an example I will come back to when I talk about the particular policies that the Concertación instituted. They did a health reform, and there's a big debate about, is this health reform a structural reform, or is it more cosmetic? So, starting with the theoretical framework of the book, we connected with those arguments that basically say that the Concertación came into power after the dictatorship with a number of authoritarian enclaves that clearly shaped and limited the way they could undertake policies. So, of course, among them, the first few here, the designated senators that were inherited by the dictatorship, instituted a majority for the political right in the Senate and in the Congress. They inherited a very powerful executive, which has the legislative power, the main legislative power in the country. I'm completely standing in your way.
No.
I'm sorry. These first 3, the role of the National Security Council, and the role, 4, and the role of the armed forces, these constituted the first major constitutional reform of President Lagos in 2005. After that, we were still left with a binomial election system and particular constitutional enclaves. Now, of these points, I'm going to focus on these 2 because they are what shapes Chile until this day, and what still shapes Chilean politics. And they are hopefully also 2 of the major reforms that will be undertaken under this current government that's just taken office last month. The binomial election system, for those of you who don't know Chile, very quickly, is a system that forces a constituency to elect 2 members. And the constitution in Chile is set up in such a way that those 2 members are most likely going to be from both sides of the political spectrum. So it kind of institutes a 50-50 split. The logic behind this was to force the number of parties that existed in Chile at the point of transition into 2 large coalitions, and therefore to institute some kind of political stability. The problem, of course, with this is that it eliminates almost all competition from the political system. And in order to have 2 representatives from the same coalition, you need to get more than 66% of the votes. So that means that 65% and 33% are pretty much equal in terms of the elected officials that you get. It's a relatively complex system, and it's very difficult to understand if you don't know Chile. I'm not going to dwell on it particularly because I assume a lot of you here will be familiar with Chile. But really, it's this system which has shaped the Chilean Congress over these 20 years and even now to this day, and it shapes how policy is made. And my co-author, Peter Ciavelis, is an institutional political scientist, so of course this is an argument that he particularly emphasizes when he analyzes Chile. In addition to this, there are constitutional enclaves, electoral enclaves. Those of you who are not familiar with Chile will not know this, certain changes, for example, to the education system can only be approved if you have a supermajority. And the constitution itself, this is normal in pretty much all countries, the constitution itself can only be changed if you have a 2/3 majority. But what is not normal in other countries is that, for example, to change the structure of the education system, you need a 3/5 majority. So, of course, a 3/5 majority is impossible to obtain if you have a binomial election system, which basically generates a 50-50 split. And one of the big problems of the Concertación, as we will see in the chapters going forward, or in the talk going forward, is that the Concertación never had a majority in the Congress. They always had maybe a few deputies more, but never an overall majority, except for 2 years under President Bachelet, and then they lost it pretty quickly. So of course this makes policy making very, very difficult. These are the authoritarian enclaves that the Concertación inherited in 1990. And of course you have to try and work with the system now. So how do you do that? They ended up inventing mechanisms that were largely informal that helped them overcome these obstacles. And these are what we call transitional enclaves. The way of doing things, the way of doing politics that was established after the transition in order to cope with this authoritarian legacy. These transitional enclaves include, they're pretty much informal institutions. They include the way candidates were selected, the way political decisions were made, largely behind closed doors, within party elite circles. The parties played an incredibly important role in this process, to the extent that some people have spoken of partidocracia, because the parties had a very powerful role to play in this, but at the same time they became increasingly during this period far removed from the electorate. So there's a whole debate and a whole analysis that has to be undertaken of the role of parties in the policy-making process. A lot of the policy-making was extra-institutional, through commissions, through advisors, through the so-called second floor. Various different presidents basically formed their own informal institutions that helped them deal with the authoritarian enclave. They had, President Frey, for example, had the Círculo de Hierro, which was his closest circle of advisors. President Lagos had the famous second floor of people who were kind of in a super ministerial position and that helped coordinate policies outside of the official institutions. President Bachelet was the first person to try to attempt to not do this, and that attempt didn't work very well, so she ended up pretty much falling into the same mechanisms and also changing her composition of cabinet during her term in office. The way political positions are distributed, who gets which cabinet post, and if a cabinet position is from a particular party, then who gets the undersecretary position, and from what party is then the undersecretary. These political machinations were part of this game, of these informal institutions that essentially instituted a different form of enclave, a transitional enclave that was a response to the authoritarian enclave, and it played out in the various different policy areas and shaped policy throughout the 20 years. Another transitional enclave which is very important and is often underestimated is the untouchability of the economic model. So there was a particular economic model, a neoliberal model if you want to call it, that was inherited from the dictatorship, that had instituted certain mechanisms, privatized services, market solutions to public policy problems, etc. And that was considered untouchable. And in some instances, in fact, it was instituted in the Constitution, as in the case of the education system, as I mentioned before. Certain mechanisms could not be changed unless you had a supermajority in the Congress. And in general, the economic model, as the economics chapter in this book also argues, became instituted as something that should not be reformed or changed. And one of the issues of analysis in this book is to what extent was this an appropriate policy choice. So these authoritarian enclaves and transitional enclaves became a distinguishing feature of these 20 years of the Concertación in office. 20 years that were entirely dominated by political elites. Unfortunately, the book is limited to the macro analysis of the elites, of how power was shared, how it was concentrated in the hands of elites, and it doesn't have a chapter, as it should have, on the clientelist structures from below that fed into this. But really it's the interaction between the two, between the macro level and the micro level, between transitional enclaves at the top and clientelism structures at the bottom, which fed into this cycle and made things even more difficult to change over time. We can talk about this in the question and answers if this is a subject of interest, but Chile tends to have an image of this as a fully functioning democracy. It's often cited as a political model. People don't associate Chile with clientelism as you do in other Latin American countries. Normally other Latin American countries come to mind first when you talk about cacique-type political structures. And one, I'd like to caution you against that, because even though it's not very explicit in the literature, the clientelist structure does exist. And one of the developments of this 20-year Concertación period has been that they became increasingly entrenched. And so, whereas in 1990 they didn't yet exist, they began to be instituted during the 1990s, and by the 2000s you basically had political caciques just as you have in the rest of Latin America or in Southern Europe. And they very much shape politics. And really the issue only came out in the last recent election as a problem. So the media used to not even mention this. In the last election, when it came to the debates about primaries and how they were being implemented, how they were being enacted, the media began to question these things. But really, on average, people aren't really aware of the extent to which the clientelism in Chile actually functions. I would even go so far as saying, vote buying in Chile is not unusual. So that's one of the things that feeds into this that unfortunately is not in the book. Chile also distinguishes itself from other Latin American countries, not all of them, but really is probably the country where you have the most homogeneous political elite, in particular in terms of how they think about development, where in other countries you might have an elite that favors neoliberalism versus a more heterodox approach. In Chile you have a bare distinction between neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, which are many consider to be pretty much the same thing. So you have an intellectual elite that bought into the model that they inherited for a very, very long period of time. And really it was only the students and the student protests that began to question this. Overall, the 20 years, there's been at the beginning, I would say in the 1990s, unfortunately I can't say this from my own personal perspective because in 1990 I wasn't yet studying in Chile, but I take it from my colleagues who were, that at the beginning of the transition there was a mística, there was a vision, there was a clear, Roberto can confirm this, he was in Chile at the time, there was a clear proyecto país, there was a clear vision of where you were going. And this vision was increasingly lost during the 1990s, and from the 2000s onwards it became very difficult to distinguish what the Proyecto País was, what the overall project was, what the vision was. And I think this is a large part of the problem that the Concertación had to face, that they actually didn't face because they didn't realize it was a problem until it was too late, until they lost the election in 2009. Now, all of this is, until now I've basically presented the Concertación as this homogeneous entity, and the criticisms that the book formulates about this period are certainly not criticisms that weren't voiced in Chile. So the Concertación is actually not this homogeneous entity that I've so far mentioned, it has various fault lines that go through it. There are political fault lines according to the parties. So on the left you have the Socialist Party and the PVD, which tend to be more progressive, and the Christian Democrats, which tend to be more conservative. If I really wanted to go into detail, I would now mention the fault lines within each individual party, but that would be taking it a little bit far for this discussion. But within each party also you have fragmented components, more conservative wings, less conservative wings. And all of this makes the assignment of positions, the porteo, which minister is selected from which fraction of which party, a puzzle. And a game that the presidents have to play to satisfy their various different coalition partners. This is not an easy task. The constituting a Chilean cabinet is not an easy task. You need to make sure you have the right amount of technocrats versus politicians, the right amount of women versus men, the right amount of people from each particular party, etc. So it's really a very complex game that presidents have to play throughout their entire period in office, not just when they nominate the cabinet. There's also always been a relatively big divide between the technocrats and the progressive left. Business interests, of course, did not coincide at all with the more progressive elements of the coalition. You had traditional transitionists, people who were involved in the transition process of the 1990s, who tended to be more gradualist in their approach, versus younger politicians who came in during the 2010 who were more in a hurry to achieve things, the new generation. But this new generation, relative to the old transition politicians, was relatively powerless for a very, very long time, and therefore didn't have that much influence. And one way of describing these two groups is by calling them, they call themselves autocomplacientes and autoflagelantes, so the people who are self-satisfied, if you want to call it that, with the progress, and those who are constantly critical of themselves for not going far enough. And there's a very interesting analysis of this particular phenomenon in the economics chapter, actually, rather interestingly, because Oscar Landerete argues that you always had a progressive wing that was pushing for more reform, for further reform, whereas the conservatives were always holding back. And under every government, this scenario shifted slightly. You'd have different people pushing for reform, or they call themselves a different group. And this entire constellation, this tension that characterizes the Concertación for 20 years, shaped it, really only fell apart during the Bachelet government, the last government, during which a number of people left the Concertación, began to found individual parties, founded their own political movements, and this created a lot of problems for the Concertación during the last 4 years in office, and were a significant part of the reason why they finally lost an election, because they called discoros, the people who disagreed with them, one of them actually ended up founding his own political movement, Rodrigo Sominami, and competed against the left, and the vote of the left became split. And this is a very important part of the explanation why the Concertación eventually lost the elections. These transitional enclaves, had several unintended consequences. In particular, they created a new way of doing things, a new type of authority, which was never intended from the beginning, but it just ended up turning out this way. You created a permanence of political elites, or put it differently, there was a failure to renew elites that went on pretty much for 20 years. And these processes became so entrenched that they really only fell apart when the Concertación lost an election and had to spend a period of office, out of office, in the opposition. And these political processes didn't just shape the Concertación. What people tend to oversee is they also shape the opposition. 20 years in opposition or out of office actually leaves you very, very unprepared for government. And so when the Piñera government took office, it had all these, it badged about all these key words of, we're going to be the efficient government, and we're going to do things properly, and we're going to show them how to do it, and these guys from the Concertación, they've been sitting in there for 20 years just pushing money around in circles and pushing paper around or whatever. They haven't been very effective. We're going to show them. Well, this new government that came in and that promised to be so effective actually was rather ineffective. So they were, in that sense, very unprepared also. Very few people who would end up working in the public sector from the opposition. And that created a problem under this last government, and explains to a very large extent why we also had. I'm at the end of 30 minutes. Okay, I'm going to be very quick. This also explains to a large extent why we had student protests. This whole period also led to a disconnect between the political elites and voter demands. And again, the student protests of 2011 were very much an expression of that. All of these underlying unintended political consequences also in turn shaped public policy, and rather than going into this in detail, I'm going to show you how some of these played out. As most of you are probably aware, there are a lot of myths associated with Chile. It's the model in the region, it's the country that developed the most, it's the most stable political transition, and there were a lot of specific myths associated with this model. For example, the Concertación successfully lowered poverty rates. That's any document that you take on Chile. I don't really care who publishes it. One of the first things that you will read about Chile when you're new to the subject is the concept that this entire period included high growth rates and they reduced poverty rates. These two things tend to be mentioned in tandem, and pretty much every document on Chile will mention this, will highlight this political achievement. We'll have a look at that in a second. Other issues are that Chile invested a huge amount of money in paying off its social debt. So Chile inherited from the dictatorship a very reduced state, high levels of poverty, and therefore invested significant amounts of money in social policies to pay off this social debt. They have certain flagship social programs, which we won't have time to go into, but also these flagship programs were put forward as their way of promoting equality, of overcoming the social debt, etc. And associated with this model is the belief that labour market problems will be resolved through economic growth. That again, we will see is a little bit questionable. And the idea that if you invest enough in social policies, such as the social debt and the poverty problems, that this investment, minimal universal benefits, will overcome the problems created by the market. I'm going to very briefly show you what the problems are with this, with these assumptions. I'm going to skip over this. This is probably the most, if I could block out these columns right now I would, but look at these two columns for now. This is probably one of the most well-known facts about Chile and about this particular period. Chile inherited from the dictatorship, inherited a very poor country with a poverty rate of almost 40% in 1990, and reduced it to 13% under President Bachelet, 15% under President Piñera after the economic crisis. This is always presented as one of the biggest achievements of the Concertación. Now, this is certainly a big achievement. It's an absolute poverty line that is based on the basic needs of the population, i.e. on a basket of goods. This is the indigence level, which was reduced from 13 to 3.7. Now, if it's true that this was a coalition that invested a significant amount of resources in social policies in order to reduce this poverty rate, then the difference between your actual poverty rate and the poverty rate without fiscal subsidies should be relatively significant. But the fact is, it isn't. There's probably about 1.5% difference on average between the real poverty rate and what that poverty rate would have been like without fiscal subsidies. So the actual social investment in poverty was relatively minimal. This poverty rate came down because of economic growth, not because of social investment. Very few people understand that because the Concertación was incredibly successful at putting out a rhetoric that basically projected a model of social success. This is the extreme poverty rate. Ironically, the gap between this one and the rate without subsidies is even smaller than the one between the absolute poverty and the poverty without fiscal subsidies. This is your explanation why your average social expenditure as a percentage of GDP doesn't really increase. The only periods when it does increase is when you have a significant economic crisis, right here. So you have an increase here, and then it drops again. You're back down to normal economic circumstances, so you're 12.1%, which is almost no different from 1990. And then you have another economic crisis, and this was Andres Velasco's peak spending, counter-cyclical expenditure, which significantly increased social expenditure, and since then it's dropped again. So this is your explanation here as to why these differences are not greater. Now, what very, very few people in Chile realize is most people know that inequality didn't change significantly during this period. Well, if you measure poverty according to absolute standards, which is what they do in Latin America, you do get a significant drop. If you measure it according to relative standards, as they do in the OECD and in European countries, you barely get a drop. So, according to these statistics, Chile looks no different almost than Mexico. But this is the basis of the official success story. Now, in 1990, this was the correct measure to use, without doubt. If everybody in a country is poor, using the relative measures makes no sense because you're just measuring relative poverty in a very poor country, where everyone's poor. So this was the right measure to use at this point in time in 1990. But at some point, these two lines cross. So this drops below the relative poverty line, and that's when they should have started using relative poverty data. So at some point, the overall wealth of the country increases, poverty drops as a result of that, and this measure becomes relatively meaningless because the basic goods that it summarizes that are required to fall below this poverty line are so minimal. The country has moved beyond that, its wealth has moved beyond that, so really you should be looking at relative poverty. This is a table that has never been put together in Chile before, that made me very unpopular for a while in Chile, and is a big explanation of why there is such a shift in Chilean politics now. So again, if we look at these statistics, this reality questions the rhetoric. And the Concertación was very successful in its rhetoric. Just a very brief example from another policy area. Most of you will be familiar with labour market problems in developing countries. Large informal sectors, high job rotation, subcontracting. These are not labour markets that are in any way comparable to a developed country. The labour reform was a process, the labour reform process stalled completely under the Concertación. This is again something that very few people know in Chile, but there was a deal that was implicit for a very long period of time, and still is to this date, between governments and employers or the business sector, which was, you let us gradually increase taxes, you let us increase social expenditure or invest in social expenditure. We will leave alone the labour code and leave the labour market up to its own devices. But in return, you will support us. And this deal is still implicit in Chile. Now, if you leave the labour market in a neoliberal economy, which is entirely market-driven up to its own devices, the following happens. This is data from the unemployment insurance system. It's administrative data. Nobody can argue with this. This is the one source of data in Chile that you cannot question. It shows you that overall, people with open-ended contracts constitute 53% of the formal wage-earning labour force. These are the best workers in Chile, the workers with the best employment conditions. 53% of them have open-ended contracts. 46%, i.e. almost half, have some form of short-term contract. I won't go into the rest of the data, but I'll sum it up by telling you that the average job duration in Chile is 22 months. For these workers with open-ended contracts, who are supposed to be employed on an indefinite long-term basis, the average duration is 28 months, just over 2 years. For these workers with atypical contracts, who shouldn't theoretically have a job duration of more than 12 months, because they're short-term, their average duration is about 18 months. So this is a very highly flexible labour market, with a labour market in which it's very, very difficult to invest in human capital, to invest in vocational training, to bring up the productivity standards of your labour force. And it's a big explanation for why the development actually remains as big as it is. Nobody has ever intervened in this from the legislative perspective. There hasn't been a labour reform that in any way attempts to shape employment conditions, because what is underlying policy making in Chile is this neoliberal model that where you don't interfere with markets. But this model was going on during a period where you didn't have a lot of data. And when this data started coming out in 2003 onwards, and really only from 2009 onwards do we know that this is actually a realistic portrayal of the Chilean labour market for various different reasons, this data began to surprise policymakers. So this is not something that policymakers at the time had expected at all, and it's a direct consequence of an economic model that left things up to the markets, and which is now really struggling with concerns about productivity, productive diversification. It's still an economy that is extremely dependent on its copper exports and prices, and therefore has a very is a big part of the explanation of why Chile, as opposed to some Asian developing countries, hasn't managed to close the development gap further. The economics chapter in this book has a very good analysis of how Chile does relative to other developing countries. Social security is a similar story. I won't go into that now. As I mentioned, in various presidencies there were transition points. I'll just use the health reform, the ALPA, as an example. There was a health reform that was supposed to institute health reform for everybody and not leave everybody covered, at least to a certain minimal standard. That health reform, when they negotiated it, was supposed to have shared financing mechanism. One big pot into which everybody paid, which was going to be financed in part by taxes, that would then provide services to all. The political right at the time when they negotiated this reform basically said, you can have a health reform, but not with a Fondo Solidario, not with a shared financing mechanism. So what President Lagos had to decide is, do I want a health reform, even though it's not the reform that I want, or do I want nothing? And he opted for having a health reform. And this is where the frontier of the possible comes into play. So you had a Concertación which was willing to push for progressive policies, but you had this entrenched opposition with a majority or with a high proportion of representatives in Congress which voted against, and that killed off many reform attempts of this kind. President Bachelet experienced similar issues during her government. You end up with a process in which the way the Concertación did politics, these transitional enclaves, became the new normal. This is a transition that went on and on and on. I would even argue that the transition went on until the very year of the student protests. It's really only the student protests that changed the way people thought about politics in Chile, and that created a space for a more progressive approach. But still, you have these entrenched elites, even in this last election. Some older senators were voted out of office. The new student leaders became new representatives and deputies. But many of the old elite are still there, and they are still very much shaping politics, even during this last election. For example, there was supposed to be official primaries in the parties, and then They took a decision to not do official primaries and to just do inter-party primaries that were organised by the individual parties. And that entire process was basically due to the fact that the political elites didn't want to generate that much competition for political positions. So this is still very much an ongoing process. And one of the big questions, of course, that comes up now is we have a new government. The student protests put new issues onto the table. Inequality has now become a very, very big concern. We have a new tax reform that is supposed to be one of the key policy aspects of this new government. Education reform likewise, and constitutional reform. And the biggest question, I think, now for Chile is under President Bachelet's new government now, to what extent will she be able to reform the constitution so that these issues can be addressed? Because it's these political issues that affect your policy, your development conclusions, and have led to the Chile that we have today. I'll leave you with the student protests. I think they're a good starting point for questions and answers. They really shook up Chile in every sense of the word. They left a right-wing government absolutely baffled in the sense that it didn't know how to deal with the protests. The fact that it didn't deal with them, didn't sit down and didn't engage with the protests meant that the protests went on and on and on and are still ongoing today. It also meant that every other social group began to organize itself and also started to protest and join in the fun. The most recent protest that occurred in Santiago was a group of mothers who were protesting for the right to breastfeed in public without getting kicked out of restaurants. So as you can see, all issues are now out on the table, and it really has changed the political spectrum in Chile and the current political debate. So with that, I'm sorry I went over the time.
Kirsty, do you want to take the questions, or would you prefer for me to?
Why don't you do?
Are there any questions or comments? Yes.
Yeah, I'd be curious if there's, I mean, going back to your data where there's the poverty reduces, and yeah, that would be great. Okay, right. So you've got the poverty rate reducing, and you've got social expenditure as a percent of GDP reducing. I mean, it just seems like
stable,
right? That's what I meant.
Except for the periods of economic crisis.
Right. That's what I meant. So, I mean, it seems like a Keynesian would probably look at this and say, well, sure, maybe the expenditure as a percentage of GDP is stable, but it could still be basically. It's still the expenditure is still responsible for reducing the poverty rate because the expenditure is what created the growth, and so then the GDP grew along with the expenditure. So I'm just curious, like, it seems like you would want to look at I'm curious if there's data for, like, in real time, did the social expenditure expand? I mean, not relative to GDP, but just like as a.
Yes, it did. So the economics chapter in the book argues that generally the way the macroeconomy in Chile was managed was relatively Keynesian. In absolute terms, of course, fiscal expenditure increased every year just because as a result of growth. They managed the first crisis, which was in 1999, much less well than the second crisis. In the first crisis, they actually increased interest rates far too soon. So it throttled economic growth and produced a very, very, very slow comeback. Whereas in the second crisis, which was actually a much bigger crisis internationally, Chile was one of the countries that suffered the least. So yes, there's an absolute increase in expenditure, but proportionately they didn't redistribute. And the big issue, the reason why this Gini is relatively constant, is that pre-tax and post-tax inequality in Chile are the same. And of course, if you compare that with any developed country, it would look very, very different. So the Chilean Gini is the same as Portugal's pre-tax. But Portugal's Gini drops to 0.34 after taxes, and Chile stays the same. And actually, when you look at the various different tax rates that income deciles pay, they all pay roughly 20%. So that's one of the biggest issues that this tax reform that's currently underway is supposed to address, by eliminating both tax loopholes for the rich and also increasing the proportion that comes, the proportion of tax revenue that comes from companies and rich individuals.
So you're saying that their rhetoric is that they did redistribute and had like stimulus that way, which would growth, but you're saying that's not really
the rhetoric isn't particularly clear or specific. It's just a generalized image of we invested heavily in social policy, partly through these flagship programs that I mentioned, Chile Solidario, Chile Barrio, etc. But also, I'll give you a very interesting example. President Bachelet undertook a pension reform in her government, which ex post was considered the most important reform of her government. Her government was the first government which was only 4 years long after President Lagos, and they went into that government with the rhythm of a 6-year government, and then realized, oh my God, we've only got 4 years, and we're not getting the appropriate amount of legislation passed, we're not getting enough stuff done. In addition to that, you get an economic crisis, so her government has to deal with an economic crisis, which they did very, very well, but you rarely get political credit for having managed a crisis very well. You don't get credit for having prevented a disaster. You only get credit for if you let a disaster happen and then respond to it effectively. So at the end of 2 years or 3 years, President Bachelet's team realized we don't really have a story to tell about what we did in these 4 years. And they literally created, they created a team of people who installed a rhetoric about this being the government that invested the most in social policy. And to an extent they did, because they invested more here as a result of the crisis. But in terms of structural changes, the only thing they did was a pension reform. And it's a pension reform that is already now being questioned as having, because it was insufficient. So the rhetoric behind this is very, very important. People just tend to look at this column of statistics and say, oh, great. And then when they start to write about Chile, they say, well, we had growth and we had reduced poverty. So, you know, best of both worlds, success story in Latin America. Oh.
Yes.
I want to ask about those periods of increased social spending and the political elites. Is this more of a case like in European economies where social spending increases because of kind of automatic stabilizing functions in social spending, which like unemployment or whatever would naturally go up, or is this more of a political reaction where the political elite is kind of anxious about the result of the crisis?
There's nothing automatic about it. There's an automatic stabilization mechanism in place now at the macroeconomic level, in the sense that a lot of the copper savings went into sovereign wealth funds that then enabled Andrés Velasco, when he was finance minister, to spend very heavily in general as a result, in order to counteract the effects of the crisis. But you have stabilizers in place at the macro level. In terms of social policy, what the philosophy of the Concertación has been is we won't institute new social expenditure without new fiscal revenue. So only when they had new fiscal revenue coming in, either from growth or that was predictably stable, did they then spend it. It's actually one of the things that the Piñera government reversed, where they started to spend social expenditure without having permanent revenue for it, and that this government is now having to readdress. But there's no automatic mechanism in here. This is a political decision to counteract the effects of a crisis. And so far that it hasn't even actually been contemplated. There are things like emergency employment programs, which they always do to contain the unemployment rate when there's a crisis. But again, it's not automatic.
Yes, Paul.
It looks like the situation that you're painting here is a political gridlock to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And you're asking for some structural changes.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, what do you think of the possibilities for this government going forward? And if you had the magic wand to dictate where you start, what would be the number one thing or two that you would do? You mentioned income taxes. There's some talk about education. There's clearly a labor union component here. Labor laws. There could be others. Where would you start?
So most definitely the 20 years of the Concertación were characterized by this institutional gridlock. The way they overcame this was by creating a consensus-style politics. So by all these informal mechanisms of policy making that I described were basically a way of pushing the liberal right that you could work with, that was closest to the Concertación, into a position where they could gather 1 or 2 votes from them and then pass a little bit legislation that was a little bit more progressive. And it's the explanation of why Chile developed on a step-by-step basis. They always took little baby steps. There are no big structural changes in this entire period, except for the Elwin government, which instituted some structural reforms at the beginning, just in order to be able to function as a democracy. That situation has now changed, at least to some extent, with this new government, because for the very first time there is a bigger majority. So President Bachelet has a majority in the Senate and a majority in Congress. Not enough of a majority to be able to, not enough of a supermajority to be able to undertake the structural reforms, but quite close, so that with a couple of votes from the liberal right, again, she can undertake structural reforms such as in the education system. This is not going to be an easy process. This is not going to be an easy government. The negotiations surrounding these reforms will be complicated, long-winded, and complex. But I think she has a better chance now of instituting change than anybody before had. Having said this, I think the right will exact its price, and some of her reforms will be curtailed and cut slightly in order to accommodate this and to get those votes. In particular with the education reform, which I think has to be one of the natural priorities to respond to the student crisis. And that reform isn't clear yet. It's not clear how it's going to work out, in what order, with what money, what they're going to do first, to what extent, etc. But she has announced that there will be free public university education for all students. So that's the goal. And she's going to work towards that goal gradually. And I think the announcement was that 70% of the students will be attending university for free by the end of this term. So that requires structural reform on a major, major scale. And it requires a tax reform in order to fund it. So that explains the 2 big priorities of her government. And the constitutional reform is, of course, in my view, the most important reform. It's on the agenda. It's going to be much more. So what the government is doing is they're going about this in the politically expedient way. They need to get the tax reform underway first. Once they've got that success under their belt, they're going to tackle education reform. That's the next less complicated issue. And then they're going to start working on the constitutional reform, or probably in parallel. The constitutional reform, I think, is the most important, because without changing the political structures, you won't be able to undertake structural policy reform. But the constitutional reform will also be the most complicated negotiation, because essentially you have a right in the opposition, a right wing within the right alliance, which is staunchly defending the legacy of the dictatorship and will not move from that position. Now, one of the interesting things that we should probably also discuss is that the Piñera government tried to reform the right and tried to install a kind of new right during his government, and that attempt failed. So the right, especially having lost the election so resoundingly, is now very much split, and it's an ongoing process. We don't know what's going to happen, but the right is currently in the process of fragmenting. So some of those fragments are very likely to support constitutional change. The question is, how far will the change go? The ideal scenario from the political science perspective would be a constitutional assembly, constituent assembly. That process is probably too long given the 4-year horizon. So she's probably not going to go for that. She's probably going to try and do it institutionally. And it's very, very difficult to get politicians to institute reforms that will make their own lives harder. So we know that.
How much of that is depend
Sorry, I'm...
No, go ahead, yes.
How much does that depend on the binomial election process? And it seems like that must be pivotal to,
It is.
to instituting these kinds of change. Is that where they plan on starting? Or?
Yeah, it's going to be part of the constitutional reform package. It's by now pretty clear that the binomial system has to go. So that there's a general consensus on the fact that the binomial election system has to go. The question is, to what extent do you replace it with something else, and how far do you go? So the devil's in the detail now.
Yes.
Yeah, your data is very compelling on the income distribution and poverty. To what extent do you stand alone with this? You mentioned that you receive a lot of negative criticism, and I wonder to what extent you might stand alone, or are there other who echo?
No, nobody disputes the data, they just don't want me to publish it.
So you sort of stand alone?
And they didn't want me to publish it under my name. But the data is, you can't argue with it.
Yes.
You mentioned the increasing activity of different social groups that want to take part of the political discourse, but also you mentioned that there is a tacit agreement so far between the business side and politics. I'm wondering how all this plays in terms of campaign finance, and how do you think that will influence the reshaping of the Congress in future years?
It's been a big issue in this last election. This last election was the best financed campaign on the centre-left side that I've ever seen. There was definitely a deal. I won't say who and with whom, but there was a big underlying deal that went on, basically saying, I'm going to give you stability and social peace. You're going to give me taxes. It's going to shape, or it will shape, the political agenda. One of the items that is not, I can't remember whether on the last slide I had the key reform, I think I took it out. Labour reform is certainly not on the agenda. And
Not on the agenda?
no. Yeah, no, sorry. I thought there was a slide there on the Bachelet government, but there isn't anymore. Certain issues, political issues, just aren't on the political agenda. They could be put onto the political agenda if the Labour movement, for example, had the capacity now to organise and to mobilise. Then it would end up being on the political agenda. But you now have a nueva mayoría, not a Concertación anymore, and the nueva mayoría includes the Communist Party. The unions are largely driven by the Communist Party. So to what extent are they going to mobilise and demonstrate and be out on the streets if the Communist Party is now in the government? So you have a very interesting process there of cooptation. We don't know yet how that's going to play out. But labour reform is certainly one of the key issues that should be on the political agenda, and that isn't. Having said that, the labour market and the employment conditions are now so bad that there's a huge cost in terms of productivity, which also affects employers. So at some point, hopefully, there's going to be some awareness of that that will shift the debate.
Yes.
The right wing in our own country here has extolled the Chilean, from 20 or 30 years ago, the replacement of pensions with private investment accounts, and extolled what a glorious success that was. Has that actually turned out over 30 years to work, or has that been reformed?
Yeah, the Heritage Foundation on a number of occasions has contacted me on that very issue, saying should we privatize our unemployment insurance and pension system based on the Chilean model, and weren't very happy when I said no. No, I mean, there's now a very big, if you focus on the issues that are the concern now, such as inequality, then you realize that all of these prior reforms that Chile inherited from the dictatorship didn't work. So you have a pension system which is as unequal as your labour market and as your income distribution. It's a pension system which pays only minimal pensions because the replacement rates are very low. Now, one of the big problems with the labour market data that I showed is if you have a labour market that's so fragmented, where rotation is so high, where employment conditions are overall very bad, remember those were the best workers, you can't possibly have proper pensions if you have a privatised pension system because they're linked. If your social policy does not work if it's linked to employment conditions that are very precarious. So that whole scenario basically failed to develop in the way they had expected it to. So they expected, by privatizing Social Security in Chile, they expected employment conditions to improve. And when you see the estimates from the period, they estimated replacement rates in the pension system of between 80 to 130%. Well, the real replacement rates are more like 42%. So they're very, very low. And all of these social security structures basically haven't worked out. The health system is even worse, the results, because the inequality in terms of health outcomes is very, very high. And unfortunately, that's one of the issues that in Chile they haven't really studied yet. It's not well known, it's not published.
So the Chicago boys were wrong?
They were wrong. They were absolutely dead wrong.
Any other questions? But we'll have time for one more before we take the last question. I have two brief announcements I'd like to make. The Center for Latin American Studies has a very full program for the rest of the semester, but I want to highlight two events we're doing. One is tomorrow, International Labor Rights and Trade, and we have Owen Hernstadt, who's the Director of International Affairs for the International Association of Machinists, and also the Chief of Staff to the President of the Machinists Union. So that's going to be tomorrow, 4 p.m. at the Center for Latin American Studies. And the second event I wanted to mention, we haven't begun publicizing yet, but that will be on April 30th at 6 p.m. It will be on our website, and it will be on women, technology, education, and the Americas. And we are very pleased to be hosting Sergio Fajardo, who's the governor of the state of Antioquia in Colombia, the former mayor of Medellin. And that will be on, as I said, April 30th. So with that, we have time for one more question.
Related, when you said about the low productivity of Chile as a result of the high rotation in the labor market, or the short period of time that people hold for a job, then what do you think are the main political reasons of this actual problem, and what should be some policies that can be applied?
Actually, the main political reason for why employment conditions have turned out like that is because there was labor policy just wasn't on the agenda. So after first initial reform, there were a number of attempted reforms of the labor code, which never really came to fruition because the opposition of employers to them was very, very severe. And also because the unions were never able to organize and to vocalize and to demonstrate and to mobilize themselves. So that's a reason why the actual reform has never been on the agenda. But in parallel to that, I would argue that politicians were not aware of the fact that their labor market was developing in this direction. So this data that I showed, which was from the unemployment insurance system, when the first administrative data came in, because until then you had survey data. The survey data was never very good, and there's no real employment survey in Chile that was very informative. When they designed the unemployment insurance system, they basically designed it with a finger in there, kind of like according to what they thought could work. They designed an unemployment insurance system, incidentally, which is also based on individual savings and individual savings accounts. The unemployment insurance system was then implemented in 2002. So they still didn't really have real labor market data in 2002. When the first data came in 2003, policymakers were absolutely horrified because they didn't expect such a high proportion of new contracts to be short-term. And then as the system was rolled out gradually and as it matured, it finally matured in 2009. So only since 2009 do we have real data on what employment conditions are like in Chile, what kind of contracts, how long people are in the same job. And we still even don't know how accurate the data is, even though it's administrative, because there's a mechanism with which Chilean employers rotate their workers between different tax IDs within one firm. So there's a percentage of that rotation, which is rotation but within the same firm, continuous rotation. And there's a percentage which is actually changes from one job to another, you know, from firm to firm. So on the one hand, there are political reasons for why there was no labour reform that was structural during this entire period. But I would also say that policymakers weren't aware of it. And in terms of your question of what would I recommend, I would now begin instituting both policy mechanisms and also labour legislation that changes the characteristics of employment contracts and makes them more homogeneous in order to counteract the segmentation that you get in a labour market in which people have different types of contracts. That would be my first objective. And my second would be to reward good behaviour by lowering unemployment contributions for employers who employ their workers for a long time and invest in their human capital or in their training. And I would punish those who rotate on a permanent basis. So I would charge higher rates at the beginning of an employment relationship by charging higher contributions to the unemployment insurance system, and then lower those rates the more people invest in training and the longer workers are in the same job. Because at the moment, it's not just employers, this has become a cultural thing now. People are permanently looking for the next job. And this is not just Chile, it's also, for example, in Brazil, they did a survey at the end of last year where they asked people about their New Year's resolutions, and 50% of people said that they were going to look for a new job. So it's something that kind of passed under the radar in Latin America. They didn't quite realize what was happening in the labor markets until it's now largely too late.
I know we're just beginning the discussion, but I want to thank Kirsten for being with us.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll have a chance to do more in the future.
Thank you very much.